Welcome back. Welcome to the Premier Mindset by Premier Performance LLC. I'm your host, Trent Mailer, LCSW, licensed clinical therapist and performance coach, and this is episode 68. I want to start with a statement that'll probably challenge the way a lot of people think about performance. The biggest performance problem in your life may have nothing to do with talent, nothing to do with intelligence, nothing to do with discipline, nothing to do with motivation. The biggest performance problem in your life might be your nervous system. Quick note before we dive in, this podcast is for education and performance growth. It's not a replacement for therapy or medical treatment. If there's something you need, make sure you go and get it. On top of it, social media accounts are all linked in the episode description. So make sure you follow along and get involved in those communities as we continue to build out and continue to put more work and content out. Now let's get back into it. Because every single day, I see talented athletes, executives, entrepreneurs, coaches, and leaders who possess the skills necessary to succeed, but cannot consistently access those skills when pressure rises. They know what to do. They have practiced what to do. They have prepared extensively. Yet when the moment arrives, performance changes, decision-making changes, confidence changes. Everything suddenly feels different. That is not always a skill problem. Often, it is a nervous system problem. Think about the athlete who looks incredible in practice, but struggles under game pressure. Think about the executive who communicates clearly until the board meeting begins. Think about the entrepreneur who has a brilliant vision until uncertainty enters the equation. The ability exists, the knowledge exists, the preparation exists. Yet something changes when stakes increase. Most people immediately assume a mindset problem. I would argue many of those situations are actually regulation problems. Because when pressure rises, your nervous system starts making decisions before your conscious mind even realizes what is happening. Your body evaluates threat. Your physiology changes. Your attention narrows. Your breathing shifts. Your muscle tension changes. And ultimately, your performance changes. This is why elite competitors become obsessed with mastering something most people completely ignore. Not motivation, not confidence, not positive thinking, state regulation. Years ago, I worked with an athlete who had all the physical tools necessary to perform at an extremely high level. During training, he looked dominant. Coaches noticed it, teammates noticed it, everyone around him noticed it. Then game day would arrive and everything would tighten. His movements became less fluid. His decision-making slowed down. He became hesitant. He started playing not to make mistakes, rather than playing to create success. The frustrating part, nothing about his talent changed. Nothing about his preparation changed. Nothing about his work ethic changed. His nervous system changed. And that changed everything. When pressure became interpreted as threat instead of challenge, performance suffered. This is where most people misunderstand elite performers. They assume elite performers experience less pressure. They don't. Elite performers often operate under more pressure than anyone else. The difference is not pressure exposure. The difference is pressure interpretation. Elite competitors learn how to experience pressure without becoming consumed by it. They understand that pressure itself is not the enemy. Dysregulation is. One of the first tools I teach high performers is what I call a pressure state audit. Instead of evaluating performance-based only outcomes, start evaluating your physiological state during performance. What happens to your breathing when pressure rises? What happens to your attention? What happens to your decision-making? What happens to your emotional control? What happens to your body language? Most people have never actually studied themselves under pressure. They study outcomes. Elite performers study states because state often predicts outcomes. The athlete who learns to identify activation early can intervene before performance collapses. The leader who recognizes escalating stress can regulate before damaging communication. The entrepreneur who notices cognitive narrowing can reset before making poor decisions. Awareness creates options, and options create performance. Another mistake people make is assuming that more activation always equals better performance. It doesn't. There is an optimal zone you want to hit. Too little activation creates passivity. Too much activation creates chaos. Elite performance exists in the middle. This is where the activation scale becomes valuable. Imagine a scale from 1 to 10. 1 is asleep and 10 is panic. Most people operate under the assumption that 10 is where elite performance happens. It isn't. 10 is survival mode. 10 is where decision quality deteriorates. 10 is where emotional control disappears. 10 is where athletes force things and leaders become reactive. Elite performers spend years learning where their ideal performance zone exists and how to return to it consistently. Because performance is not about maximum intensity, it's about optimal intensity. That distinction changes everything, and that's really our goal here, optimization. One of the most revealing questions you can ask yourself is this: can I consistently access my abilities when pressure rises? Not occasionally, consistently. Because that is where elite performance lives. Consistency under pressure. Anyone can perform when conditions are perfect. Anyone can lead when everything is going well. Anyone can communicate effectively when stress is low. The true test comes when uncertainty enters the room. That's when nervous systems get exposed. That's when preparation gets tested. That's when regulation becomes visible. And here's what makes this conversation so important. Many high performers unknowingly create lifestyles that destroy regulation. They sacrifice sleep. They normalize chronic stress. They eliminate recovery. They stay constantly activated. Then they wonder why performance becomes inconsistent. The nervous system keeps score, whether you acknowledge it or not. You cannot continuously withdraw energy without making deposits. Which is why another framework we will build throughout this episode is the recovery to output ratio. Most people obsess over output. Elite performers track recovery with equal seriousness, because recovery is not the reward for performance. Recovery is part of the performance. That distinction separates sustainable excellence from temporary success. The athlete who ignores recovery eventually loses access to their best performance. The executive who ignores recovery eventually loses decision quality. The entrepreneur who ignores recovery eventually loses creativity. Nobody outruns physiology forever. Eventually, the bill arrives. And when it does, most people blame motivation. They blame circumstances. They blame opportunity. Rarely do they examine the system underneath everything, their nervous system. As we continue through this episode, I want you to consider a possibility. What if the next level of your performance does not require becoming more talented? What if it requires becoming more regulated? What if the biggest gap between where you are and where you want to be is not effort? What if it's access? Access to your skills, access to your confidence, access to your decision making, access to your leadership, access to your best self when pressure arrives. Because the greatest performance limitation for many people is not a lack of skill. It is that their nervous system cannot consistently access the skill they already possess. And once you understand that, the entire conversation around elite performance changes. Because now we're no longer talking about talent. We're talking about regulation. And that's where things get really interesting. One of the biggest mistakes people make when thinking about nervous system regulation is assuming it's purely personal. They assume regulation matters because it helps them perform better. They assume it helps them stay calm, think clearly, and make better decisions. All of that is true, but at higher levels of leadership, your nervous system stops being just your business. It becomes everyone else's business too. Because whether you realize it or not, your nervous system is constantly communicating information to the people around you. Most leaders dramatically underestimate how much of leadership is physiological. They focus on strategy, communication, vision, accountability, and decision making. And don't get me wrong, those things matter. But before people process your words, they process your energy state. They notice your facial expressions. They notice your tone. They notice your energy. They notice your pacing. They notice whether you appear grounded or chaotic. Human beings are constantly reading one another for cues about safety, threat, certainty, and confidence. We are social animals at the core of us. This is why emotional contagion is such a powerful force inside teams, organizations, and relationships. Because emotional states spread. Stress spreads. Anxiety spreads. Confidence spreads. Calm spreads. Stability spreads. Every room has an emotional climate, and leaders often play a larger role in creating that climate than they realize. The nervous system is constantly asking a question beneath conscious awareness. Is this environment safe enough to perform well? Think about the difference between being around someone who is grounded under pressure versus someone who becomes reactive under pressure. The grounded person creates stability. They create clarity. They create confidence. The reactive person creates uncertainty. People become cautious around them. Communication changes around them. Decision-making changes around them. The entire system starts adapting to the leader's state. I remember a leadership team I worked with several years ago. The organization was facing a difficult quarter. Revenue was below expectations. Pressure was building. Stakeholders wanted answers. The leadership team entered a meeting to discuss next steps. And before a single solution was discussed, the room already felt tense. People were guarded. People were hesitant. People were waiting to see how the leader would respond. The meeting started with a simple update on performance metrics. The numbers were not where they needed to be. The moment the leader saw the report, everything shifted. His breathing became faster. His tone became sharper. He interrupted people repeatedly. He dismissed ideas before they were fully explained. Questions that should have generated discussion suddenly felt dangerous to ask. Within minutes, the nervous system of the room had changed. What happened next was fascinating. The leader thought he was pushing for accountability. The team experienced it as threat. So creativity dropped. Participation dropped. Risk-taking disappeared. People stopped offering innovative ideas. They began offering safe ideas. They stopped thinking about what could move the organization forward and started thinking about how to avoid criticism. The entire room moved from performance mode into protection mode. That is what many leaders fail to understand. Human beings do not perform their best when they're operating from survival. When the nervous system detects threat, resources shift, attention narrows, creativity decreases, flexibility decreases. Complex problem solving becomes more difficult. The body becomes focused on protection rather than optimization. The team may still function, but it is rarely functioning at its highest level. This is why one of the most important leadership tools is what I call an emotional temperature check. Before important conversations, before critical meetings, before major decisions, leaders need to ask themselves a simple question. What state am I bringing into this room? Not what strategy, not what agenda, not what talking points. What state? Because your state often arrives before your message does. Many people assume leadership communication starts when you begin speaking. In reality, leadership communication often starts the moment you enter the room. People are observing, people are interpreting, people are looking for clues. They're asking themselves whether this environment feels stable, whether this conversation feels productive, and whether they can think clearly in your presence. Your nervous system is already communicating long before your words begin. This becomes especially important during uncertainty. Anybody can appear composed when things are going well. Anybody can seem confident when outcomes are favorable. The true test of regulation happens when pressure rises. The true test happens when things are unclear, uncomfortable, and unpredictable. That is when nervous systems become visible. That is when leadership becomes exposed. One of the most dangerous leadership habits is communicating while dysregulated. When people are activated, they often believe they are thinking clearly. In reality, activation frequently narrows perception. They become more reactive, more defensive, more impulsive. They overestimate threats. They underestimate opportunities. They hear criticism where there's none. They create conflict where none was necessary. This is why state management before communication is such a valuable practice. Elite leaders do not simply prepare what they are going to say. They prepare the state from which they're going to say it. Sometimes that means taking 5 minutes before a difficult conversation. Sometimes it means regulated breathing. Sometimes it means slowing down. Sometimes it means delaying communication until clarity returns. The goal is not perfection. The goal is preventing unnecessary damage. One of the simplest questions a leader can ask before speaking is this: am I responding to the current situation, or am I responding to my nervous system's reaction to the current situation? Those are not always the same thing. Many leadership mistakes happen because people confuse emotional activation with objective reality. They assume their urgency is accuracy. They assume their anxiety is insight. They assume their frustration is truth. The best leaders create a buffer between activation and action. They do not eliminate emotion. They do not suppress emotion. They create enough regulation to make intentional decisions rather than reactive decisions. That small gap often determines whether a team becomes stronger under pressure or fractures under pressure. Another tool that becomes critical here is regulation before decision making. When stakes are high, people often feel pressure to act immediately. Sometimes immediate action is necessary. Often it is not. Elite performers understand that the quality of decision matters more than the speed of a decision. If your nervous system is flooded, your ability to accurately evaluate options decreases. The decision may feel urgent, but urgency and importance are not always the same thing. This is where leadership recovery windows become valuable. Most leaders build schedules around tasks. Elite leaders build schedules around states. They understand that recovery is not simply physical. It is cognitive and emotional. They create moments that allow the nervous system to reset before entering the next demand. They recognize that carrying activation from one interaction into the next eventually compounds performance problems. Think about how often leaders move from stressful meeting to stressful meeting without any intentional regulation. The nervous system accumulates activation throughout the day. Decision quality begins declining, emotional flexibility decreases, patience decreases, perspective narrows. Then people wonder why they became reactive later in the afternoon. The answer is often not complexity. The answer is accumulated dysregulation. There is an idea I often think about when working with high performers. People do not merely follow your words. They follow your nervous system. They follow the emotional signals you send. They follow the stability you model. They follow the pressure habits you normalize. They follow the way you respond when things become difficult. Whether you realize it or not, your regulation teaches. That is why nervous system mastery is not just personal development work. It is leadership work. It is culture work. It is performance work. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to either increase regulation or increase chaos. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to strengthen trust or weaken trust. Every response becomes an opportunity to create clarity or create confusion. As performance demands continue increasing in modern athletics, business, and leadership, this skill becomes even more valuable. The environments are faster, the stakes are higher, the pressure is more constant, which means the ability to regulate under stress becomes a competitive advantage. Not because pressure disappears, but because regulation allows people to function effectively within pressure. And once you begin seeing nervous systems through that lens, a deeper question emerges. If elite performers consistently regulate better under pressure, what exactly are they doing differently? Are they simply born with better regulation? Are they naturally calmer? Or is there something trainable underneath all of this? Because that is where the conversation becomes even more interesting. Elite competitors are not calm because pressure is absent. They are calm because they have trained for pressure in ways most people never do. At some point, every high performer runs into the same realization. Working harder is not always the answer. That statement frustrates a lot of people because hard work matters, discipline matters, effort matters, and preparation matters. Nobody gets to elite levels without those things. But there comes a point where the next level is not unlocked by increasing effort. It is unlocked by improving access. Access to clarity, decision-making, emotional control, and skills that have already existed but became unavailable when pressure arises. This is where elite competitors begin separating themselves from everybody else. Most people train performance, while elite competitors train access to performance. And that distinction changes everything. The reason this matters is because your nervous system adapts to whatever is repeatedly experienced. If you repeatedly expose yourself to challenge while remaining regulated, your system learns that challenge is manageable. If you repeatedly experience challenge while becoming overwhelmed, your system learns that challenge is threatening. Over time, those experiences become automatic patterns, and eventually your body begins making predictions before your conscious mind even has time to evaluate what is happening. This is one reason why two people can enter the exact same situation and respond completely differently. One sees opportunity while another sees threat. One becomes focused while the other becomes flooded. The environment is identical, but the nervous system response is not. Elite competitors understand this principle better than most people realize. They know that performance is not built only through repetition. It is built through adaptation. They're constantly teaching their nervous system what pressure means. They're teaching their system that difficult situations do not automatically equal danger. They're teaching themselves that discomfort is something to move through rather than escape. This is where stress exposure training becomes incredibly important. Many people spend their lives avoiding discomfort, while elite performers deliberately train around it. The best athletes do not merely train physical skills. They train physical skills while tired, fatigued, frustrated, under time constraint, and under pressure because they understand something important. Pressure is a skill. Pressure tolerance is trainable. Stress adaptation is trainable. The goal is not to eliminate stress, but to become increasingly capable inside stress. That principle applies far beyond athletics. The best executives intentionally place themselves in difficult conversations. The best leaders repeatedly enter situations that require uncertainty tolerance. The best entrepreneurs develop the ability to operate without immediate reassurance. They are not avoiding pressure. They are becoming familiar with it because familiarity changes physiology. The unknown creates anxiety, while the familiar creates confidence. One of the biggest mistakes I see among ambitious people is that they're constantly chasing growth, but rarely measuring adaptation. They track revenue, performance, outcomes, and accomplishments. Very few track nervous system development. This is where nervous system baseline tracking becomes valuable. Start paying attention to how quickly you recover from stress. Start paying attention to how long frustration affects your mood, how much uncertainty it takes before your thinking narrows, and how often pressure hijacks your ability to perform. Those observations tell you far more about your development than most traditional performance metrics, because elite performance is not simply measured by output, it is measured by stability. A person who performs well only when conditions are favorable is not yet operating at an elite level. The ability to remain functional when conditions become unfavorable is what separates high performers from everybody else. I learned this lesson personally years ago. There were periods where I believed the answer was simply working harder. If something wasn't progressing quickly enough, I pushed harder. If a challenge emerged, I pushed harder. If uncertainty showed up, I pushed harder. Sometimes it worked, but eventually it stopped working because effort without regulation creates diminishing returns. I remember realizing that I could be physically present in a room while mentally operating at half capacity because my nervous system was carrying more activation than I recognized. My preparation was still there. My knowledge was still there. My experience was still there. Yet access to those things was reduced. That realization forced me to start treating regulation as part of performance rather than something separate from performance. That shift changed how I viewed excellence. One of the fastest ways to influence your state under pressure is through breathing. Now, I know some people immediately hear breathing techniques and dismiss them because they sound simple. Elite performers understand something different. Simple does not mean ineffective. Sometimes simple is what we need. Your breathing patterns directly influence your physiological state. When activation rises, breathing often becomes shallow, rapid, and inefficient. That pattern signals increased threat to the nervous system. Over time, it amplifies the very response that it is undermining your performance. Performance breathing protocols interrupt that cycle before it gains momentum. When elite athletes prepare for competition, when military personnel prepare for high-pressure situations, and when executives prepare for critical conversations, many intentionally use breathing to influence activation levels before pressure arrives. They do not wait until they are overwhelmed. They regulate proactively. That distinction matters. The best competitors do not spend all of their energy trying to recover from dysregulation. They spend much of their energy preventing unnecessary dysregulation in the first place. Prevention often creates a larger performance advantage than just recovery. Another skill elite performers develop is attention control. Most people think focus is something you either have or do not have, but that is not how it works. Attention is trainable. Pressure attacks attention before it attacks performance. When activation rises, attention narrows. Sometimes that helps, but sometimes it becomes destructive. The athlete begins thinking about the last mistake instead of the next play. The executive becomes fixated on a single problem while missing larger strategic considerations. And the entrepreneur becomes trapped inside worst-case scenarios. The issue is not intelligence. The issue is attention. Attention determines perception. Perception influences decision-making. And decision-making influences performance. This is why attention reset rituals become valuable. Elite performers often have intentional routines that help them redirect focus back to what matters. Sometimes it is a specific breathing sequence, sometimes it's a physical movement, a verbal cue, or a short reset process between performances. What matters is not the exact ritual. What matters is the consistency. The nervous system responds well to predictable patterns. Predictable patterns create stability. Stability creates access. Access creates performance. Another concept that deserves far more attention is recovery debt. Most ambitious people understand financial debt, but far fewer understand recovery debt. Every time you push output without adequate recovery, a bill accumulates. The problem is that unlike financial debt, recovery debt often feels invisible until performance starts declining. Decision quality deteriorates, emotional control becomes harder, creativity decreases, motivation fluctuates. Small problems begin feeling larger than they actually are. Many people interpret those experiences as personal weakness when they are often signals of accumulated physiological debt. The nervous system has limits, and elite performers respect those limits, not because they're soft, but because they're strategic. This is where recovery scheduling becomes essential. Notice I did not say recovery when convenient. I said recovery scheduling. The difference is enormous. Most people treat recovery as something they will do after everything else gets finished. Elite performers understand everything else becomes harder if recovery never happens. Recovery is placed in the calendar with intentionality because it directly affects performance capacity. They understand something many people never learned. Recovery is not separate from performance. Recovery is performance. The highest performing people in the world are often exceptionally disciplined about protecting the system that allows them to continue performing. As we begin to bring this section to a close, I want you to consider something. The calmness you see from elite competitors is often misunderstood. People assume elite competitors are calm because pressure does not affect them. That is rarely true. Pressure affects them. Stress affects them. Uncertainty affects them. The difference is that they have spent years building systems that allow them to function effectively anyway. They have trained regulation as intentionally as they trained skill. They have trained recovery as intentionally as they've trained output. They have trained adaptability as intentionally as they trained execution. Elite performers are not calm because pressure is absent. They are calm because they have trained for pressure. Once you understand that, the conversation changes again, because now we are no longer discussing temporary performance. We are discussing sustainable excellence. And that is where the final piece of this conversation takes us. At the highest levels of performance, the conversation eventually stops being about how high you can climb and starts becoming about how long you can stay there. Most people are fascinated by achievement. Very few people are fascinated by sustainability. They study championship moments, record-breaking seasons, billion-dollar companies, and breakthrough successes. They pay far less attention to what allowed those people to remain effective for years, sometimes decades, under enormous pressure. What separates many elite performers from everyone else is not simply their ability to perform at a high level. It is their ability to continue performing at a high level without destroying themselves in the process. One of the most dangerous myths in performance culture is the belief that greatness requires self-destruction. There's almost a romantic quality attached to burnout in certain circles. People brag about exhaustion. They wear sleep deprivation like a badge of honor. They normalize chronic stress. They celebrate operating at maximum intensity every day as if sustainability is somehow weakness. The problem is that physiology does not care about your beliefs. Your nervous system will eventually demand payment for every withdrawal you make without sufficient recovery. The only question is whether that payment arrives gradually or all at once. This becomes increasingly important as responsibilities grow. A young athlete may be able to get away with poor recovery for a period of time. A new entrepreneur might temporarily compensate through sheer effort. An executive might survive for months operating on stress hormones and urgency. Eventually, the equation changes. The demand becomes larger. The consequences become greater. The margin for error becomes smaller. At that point, nervous system management is no longer a luxury. It becomes a prerequisite for sustained excellence. One of the reasons elite performers continue to separate themselves over time is because they begin viewing recovery differently than most people. Average performers often see recovery as the absence of work. Elite performers see recovery as preparation for future work. That distinction matters. When recovery becomes part of the performance plan rather than something squeezed in when convenient, everything changes. Decision quality improves, emotional stability improves, creativity improves, consistency improves. The same person suddenly becomes capable of expressing far more of their potential simply because the system supporting performance is functioning optimally. This is where long horizon recovery planning becomes incredibly valuable. Instead of asking how you recover this weekend, start asking how you will sustain excellence over the next 5 years. Instead of focusing only on today's workload, start evaluating whether your current habits are creating a nervous system capable of supporting your future ambitions. The bigger the goal, the more important this question becomes. Many people are building visions that require elite performance while simultaneously maintaining lifestyles that guarantee burnout. Those two realities cannot coexist forever. Eventually, one will win. The leader who sustains greatness understands that energy management is often more important than time management. Everyone receives the same 24 hours. Not everyone has the same quality of energy available during those hours. A regulated nervous system allows someone to access focus more consistently, recover from setbacks more efficiently, and navigate conflict more effectively, and remain adaptable under pressure. Those advantages compound over time. 5 years later, what appears to be extraordinary success is often the result of thousands of small moments of regulation that nobody else noticed. This is why performance sustainability reviews become such an important tool. Every quarter, every 6 months, or at a minimum, once a year, high performers should evaluate more than outcomes. They should evaluate the condition of the system producing those outcomes. Is stress accumulating faster than recovery? Is decision fatigue increasing? Is emotional volatility becoming more common? Is motivation becoming dependent on pressure and urgency? Are relationships deteriorating because performance has become the only priority? These questions often reveal performance risks long before traditional metrics do. One of the most fascinating things about elite competitors is that many eventually discover a truth that initially feels counterintuitive. The goal is not maximum intensity. The goal is strategic intensity. Constant intensity creates instability. Strategic intensity creates longevity. Elite performers know when to accelerate and when to recover. They know when to push and when to reset. They understand that a nervous system operating at maximum activation indefinitely eventually becomes less effective, not more effective. Greatness is often less about living at 100% and more about knowing when 100% is actually required. This concept becomes even more important when leadership enters the equation. Earlier, we talked about how your nervous system influences everyone around you. That reality becomes magnified over years. A regulated leader creates stability. Stable environments create trust. Trust creates innovation. Innovation creates growth. Growth creates opportunity. The opposite sequence is equally true. Dysregulated leaders create uncertainty. Uncertainty creates hypervigilance. Hypervigilance reduces creativity. Reduced creativity limits growth. The nervous system of a leader can quietly shape the trajectory of an entire organization. There's another layer to this conversation that often gets overlooked. Eventually, performance becomes part of identity. Many ambitious people define themselves by what they achieve. Their worth becomes connected to output. Their confidence becomes connected to results. Their self-image becomes connected to performance. This creates a dangerous situation because performance naturally fluctuates. Every athlete experiences setbacks. Every entrepreneur encounters failures. Every executive faces adversity. When identity becomes completely fused with achievement, every setback starts feeling personal rather than informational. The strongest performers learn something different. They build what I call regulated ambition. They remain deeply driven. They remain competitive. They remain committed to excellence. At the same time, they refuse to tie their entire identity to outcomes. Their nervous system is not constantly swinging between euphoria and despair based on external results. They maintain perspective. They maintain adaptability. They maintain stability. That stability becomes a competitive advantage because it allows them to continue performing while others are consumed by emotional volatility. I want you to think about something for a moment. Imagine two individuals with identical intelligence, identical talent, identical resources, identical opportunities, and identical work ethic. One spends 10 years strengthening skills while neglecting their nervous system health. The other spends 10 years strengthening skills while simultaneously developing regulation, recovery, adaptability, emotional control, and sustainable performance systems. Which person do you think will operating closer to their potential at the end of that decade? Which person will have greater resilience? Which person will have more energy? Which person will have more capacity to continue growing? The answer becomes obvious once you see the full picture. This may be the most important part of the entire episode. Many talented people spend years trying to improve the expression of performance while ignoring the system responsible for expressing performance. They buy books, they attend conferences, they acquire certifications, they develop technical skills, they optimize strategies. Meanwhile, the nervous system carrying all of those abilities remains chronically stressed, under-recovered, and overloaded. Then they wonder why they cannot consistently access what they know. The issue is not always capability. Sometimes the issue is capacity. Think about how many extraordinary people have disappeared from leadership positions, athletics, business, or entrepreneurship, not because they lack talent, but because they lack sustainability. Think about how many careers have been shortened by burnout. Think about how many opportunities have been missed because exhaustion was mistaken for commitment. Think about how many relationships have been damaged because performance became prioritized over regulation. The graveyard of unrealized potential is filled with talented individuals whose nervous system could not sustain the demands placed upon them. The future of elite performance will increasingly belong to people who understand this distinction. The next generation of high performers will not simply train harder, they will train smarter. They will understand that recovery is not weakness, regulation is not weakness, adaptability is not weakness, nervous system optimization is not weakness. These are all competitive advantages. These are performance multipliers. These are the foundations that allow greatness to last. If you're listening to this episode and recognizing gaps in your own system, that awareness is valuable. Awareness creates options. Recognition is always the first step. But awareness alone is never enough. Knowledge does not automatically create change. Education does not automatically create implementation. Insight does not automatically create performance. High performers understand that accountability accelerates growth. They seek objective feedback. They seek coaching. They seek systems. They seek environments that challenge them to execute consistently rather than simply understand concepts intellectually. This is one of the reasons Premier Performance exists. Whether someone is an athlete, executive, entrepreneur, coach, or leader, the goal is not merely to help them perform better for a moment. The goal is to help them build systems that support sustainable elite performance over time. Nervous system optimization, emotional regulation, performance coaching, recovery planning, leadership development, and accountability all become part of the same conversation because they're all connected. Performance is never isolated from the system producing it. As we close this episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. Most people spend their lives trying to strengthen their skills. Elite performers eventually realize they must also strengthen the system responsible for expressing those skills under pressure. Skills matter. Talent matters. Intelligence matters. Work ethic matters. None of those things disappear. But if the nervous system supporting them cannot consistently access them when it matters most, potential remains trapped beneath the surface. The question is no longer whether you are talented enough. The question is whether your nervous system can support the level of performance your ambitions demand. Because in the end, greatness is not built by the person who can perform at an elite level once. Greatness belongs to the person who can repeatedly access their best self, recover effectively, and adapt under pressure, lead with stability, and continue growing year after year after year. Your talent determines how high you can climb. Your nervous system determines how long you can stay there. Resilient minds, premier results. That's what we're building here with the Premier Mindset, and hopefully this episode gives you some more feedback and insight into who we are and what we need to do to reach these high levels of optimization and performance. As always, this episode is meant to provide tools for performance, not replace individualized therapy. If you're struggling with anxiety, burnout, stress, professional guidance is always critical. At Premier Performance LLC, we work with high achievers to implement strategies like these with precision, accountability, and results. If you want to work on it together, just reach out and get something scheduled. We do free consultation calls just to talk and make sure we're a good fit before we get things going. So if you'd like to get something set up, just reach out and we'll get it going. I also make it a point to give you actionable tools to find success in your life. So let me know if it's helping. I love staying connected with all of you. I want to hear about the successes, the failures, the heartbreaks, and everything in between. And if something's working, let me know. If there's something that could be improved and could help you more, let me know. I want to know. I'd also love to hear how this episode specifically impacts you. If it's helpful, if it does hit a point that you needed it to hit on, or maybe it brought up an idea that you haven't thought about in a long time. If there's someone in your life that you feel like could benefit from hearing this, I hope you share it with them and send it their way. It might be exactly what they've been waiting for. If it was helpful for you, please leave us a review. It's really helpful for us to get this in front of more people by getting more reviews. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If you have anything that you need from us, whether it's a question, a request, or you just want to work together or something else, you can reach out to me in a lot of different ways. The first way is through email. My email is tmailer@premierperformancereno.com. My last name is spelled Mahler. You can also text or call me directly at 775-561-0056. We have our Instagram and TikTok, which both have the same name, where we post content every day. And those names are Premier_Performance_Reno for both of those. We have the Facebook page and the LinkedIn page that both have the same name as well, which is Premier Performance LLC for both of those. And then we have the Twitter or the X account, which is @PremierReno_LLC. And finally, our website is www.premierperformancereno.com, where we post a bunch of this stuff too. So every day we're putting out more content on our social media sites. We're going to continue to do that. And every week we're putting out new podcast episodes. So get into these communities and continue to follow along so you don't miss out on this new stuff that we keep on putting out to help increase your performance and help you activate your life at the highest levels that it could be. Next week, we're going to jump into the hidden addictions to chaos that are in competitive athletes. We're really going to explore that and what that looks like, because a lot of people aren't even aware that that's happening to them, but it's more common than they think. So we'll dive into that, see if that does include you. You might hear yourself in that episode. Other than that, go be the best you can be. Put yourself out there and go do some things that scare you a little bit. Don't be afraid of your possibility and the growth you could reach, but you got to put yourself out there to go get it. I hope you guys have a good one, and I'll see you all soon, and I'll talk to you all again next week. Bye.